Okay, so in this part of the series, we're going to be examining the Photoshop document of this design. Now, don't worry if you don't have the Photoshop document, it doesn't really matter. We're just going to be talking about the techniques that we'll be using to actually build this design when we translate this into code. So let's go ahead and zoom in on this, and we'll take a look at each of the elements that we're going to be building, and we'll see, what kind of markup we can use, what kind of styles that we're going to use, and we'll also talk about things like fonts and colors as well. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the header, this part at the top here with the logo up here, and also these menu items here with this button here. Now you can see that actually before we discuss any of that, you can see that there are these blue lines coming down the page here. Now what these represent is these represent columns in a grid system, and we can tell if we just zoom out a little bit that this is a 12 column layout. We've got 12 columns here. So we know that we can use a grid system and we can go ahead and use 12 columns for this. And this basically helps us space things out. So we know that things have to be specific widths, or not specific widths, but specific ratio in, specific positions in ratio to each other. So you can see here that these are all nicely lined up here. This is lined up with the edge of this here. This button is lined up with the edge here. Now we're not necessarily going to be focusing on that. We're going to be focusing more on the technical side of it. It's entirely up to you whether you build something to be absolutely perfect to the design, but personally I think that it's not necessarily required. As long as it looks okay and the code's fine, then you should be okay. But obviously this is an example of 1 in a million. We're going to be talking more about the technical side of taking each of these elements and starting to build them into a page. So we'll be building this header here, this here, this here, and this recent work section here. So again, let's go back to the header here. You can see that we've got a logo, if you like, and this is actually using a specific font. So later what we'll do is we'll come in with a text tool, we'll click on this, and it tells us this particular font isn't actually available on my system, but from here we can tell that we need this Pacifico Regular. So we're going to go ahead and grab that from Google Fonts or whatever. We'll probably be using Google Fonts, and then go ahead and apply that to the page. So most of these fonts are available for free. There's one I think that isn't available for free, and that's this one here. So we're going to just substitute in with the next best thing. It doesn't really matter too much. So the navigation is not tricky, but slightly trickier. The logo is fairly easy. This whole top section will be just a row of columns, and we'll have a column to the left and the right. However, with these menu items, we're going to be using an unordered list here. And we'll have an unordered list with home, services, portfolio, blog, about, contact, and sign up as well. Despite the fact that this is slightly differently designed, we have this big button here, this sort of call to action to sign up. So we'll be including this in our entire list of unordered list because from a markup point of view that makes sense. This is part of the top level navigation, so we want to still keep that inside of the markup. We don't want to create a separate element here and go ahead and float that right or whatever. Another thing to mention is that how we're going to be styling these buttons. Well, because we're going to be using the foundation framework, which we'll take a look at in the next video. This includes styles for things like buttons, but we're going to have to override some of them default styles. So the buttons like you see here isn't going to be a problem. Obviously with this little cursor we're not going to include that on the design because that's just a sort of nicety. Okay, so down to this next section we've got basically a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 column section here, so basically half of the width of the page with this image in. So in this case all we're going to be doing is literally cutting this image up and saving it somewhere, and then going ahead and popping it in as an image element or something like that. So this will just be an image element. We do have a slider here, but we're not talking about JavaScript in this video, we're just talking about the styling this, so we're going to leave this out, but this could be obviously included in a slider. and this makes things happen here. Now, because we don't have the font, you could go ahead and cut this out as an image, but it would be a terrible waste of another HTTP request to download this. So what we're going to do is we're just going to use the next best font that we can find, and we'll just sort of guess things and, you know, see how it looks, change some line height and see how things look here. But this is just literally just going to be text, you know, as maybe a header or something like that. It could be anything really, but yeah, that will basically just be in this side of the grid. So that's that here. Oh, and also we've got this orange background as well. And notice that the orange background comes outside of the grid. So what we're going to have to do is create our own containers that fill the entire width of the page. We're also going to have to do some sort of change some properties on the body to get rid of the default margins that you'd find. And then we'll have our grid or row start from here. So this will all make sense later if it doesn't already. Okay, so for the next part, we've got these three elements here. The first thing that sort of screams out of me when I look at this is the fact that we need 4 columns. So 4, 8, 12. That's a 12-column grid. So we have 4, 8, 12. There's also images here as well, so we can go ahead and cut these out and use these here. And then we've got little headers here, and then just a paragraph there. So really this part isn't too tricky. We don't need to go ahead and apply any container with any specific color here because it's just white. We'll leave the default background of the page as white. So really that's all for that one. If we go ahead and scroll down again to this part, again we need a container here, a sort of green container that will fill the entire width of the page, and then we have our normal grid in here. You see how these elements stop at the edge here, and on this side as well. And for recent works and then this paragraph here, we can just use another header and another paragraph. For this, we're going to use an unordered list, and we'll give it a sort of generic class that allows it to look like this. So this looks like it's a selected state, so it's just a solid white background there and a green color for the text. The normal text looks white, and then for a hover effect noted by this sort of cursor here, you can see that we've got a you know, just a white outline. So again, this is a similar deal to the header, but it's going to obviously work slightly differently. Okay, so down to these items here, you can see that we've got lots of images here, so there's lots of cutting up of these images to do here. What we're not going to do is cut up this entire bit here, because that would be a massive waste. All we're going to do is create transparent items of these little images in here, and the reason for that is that we can use CSS easily to create these containers and create the colors for them as well. And what we'll be doing is creating a background hook, so we'll have a background red, a background off-white or white, background dark grey, background yellow, blue, whatever. And they'll just be applied to each of these containers. Now in terms of this being a grid, this is perfect because we can have a 4 grid, and a 4 grid, and that will add up to 12, and we'll get nice spacing between here as well. By default, we'll add a margin down here to just separate this, and that goes all the way down there, and that's it really. So we've got this you know, these 3 sections. There's quite a lot of work to be done, but basically most of it's taken up, or most of it looks nice due to the colors here. So that's pretty much it. In terms of general things like you know, spacing between elements, header styles, we'll stick to the defaults where we can, but for example what we're going to be doing is we're going to be calling this section here without the header a feature, and then we can go ahead and set that accordingly. We'll give a, you know, we'll use the nav, the HTML5 nav element for this top part here, and a header for the top part as well. So we can come in and say, you know, that we want the header main or the navigation main to be this kind of style. And the same for this as well. We'll call this like features, for example, plural, and then we can go ahead and style the headers appropriately. And the same for this as well. We can call this recent, this whole area here, call this recent, and style the header and the, you know, the font accordingly. And again, we'll go ahead and add classes to these which give it the, you know, width and height it requires, or the padding it requires, and then we'll add the image in there. Same for this here. So that's pretty much it. That's just taking an overall look at the design and how we might tackle each of the items. What we're going to do next is look at Foundation, which is a CSS front-end framework, and we'll look at installing this as well and how we're going to be using this to actually, start to build up our design.